Right. Are we all in? Are we? Good. They're locking the doors. You can't get out now. Welcome, everybody. This is the second time we've done the Overboard event. It's going to become a classic of the annual events for Classics for All, created by Dr. Emma Smith. I'm going to introduce her. Emma's actually got a new book out called The Cambridge Companion to Greek Epic. It's flying off the shelves, so do get your copy for that. I want to thank Linklaters for this very generous offer, especially Jamie Wootton and Emma Temperton. I think they probably deserve a round of applause. As you know, organisations like Classics for All can't function without generous donations, although we have declared it, and I just want to say that all my clothes were bought by me. I think. So, yes, so now we've got we've got five really, stars of the Classics world tonight. So we're going to duke it out, fight it out, to see which of their particular choices gets thrown overboard. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the wonderful Dr. Emma Greensmith, who's going to explain the format.
Thank you, Jimmy, and thank you to everybody for being here tonight. So, yes, it's my job really just to kind of set the scene, to explain the format, and to get you in the right mindset for what is to come. And as I did last year, I think the best way to do this is to engage a bit of old-fashioned imaginative thinking. So, I want you to imagine this scene. You can close your eyes if you so wish to become truly mindful, but I'm going to check if you are, but focus. You all had a long day at work, so. It's the middle of the Aegean Sea. It is an unspecified time in the deep ancient past. But the key thing is, it is aquatic. There is water everywhere, and not a shoreline in sight. And the only thing visible is a boat. And the slide there gives you an indication, but I would ask you to dwindle that. That is far too elaborate for the kind of boat we have in mind. It's much more flimsy. Think Odysseus's raft rather than that gorgeous creation. And the weather is appalling. It makes this week look like a sunny afternoon. Rain is gushing, wind is howling. Everything is truly tumultuous. It's Poseidon doing his finest work, effectively. And it is quickly becoming apparent to the passengers on the boat that this is not working out. And the passengers on the boat, in total number, are 4. And there has been a wonderful alchemy of space-time continuum that has meant that these 4 particular passengers do coexist at this unspecified time in antiquity and are on this boat. Lucky for us, but not so lucky for them. Now, because of the tumultuous conditions, it is becoming increasingly and desperately clear that the weight of this boat is too great. The centre cannot hold, and they need to shift some cargo. And there's nothing else on the boat other than these 4 horrible, desperate figures. So, who stays and who goes? And that is the intellectual, and indeed it is intellectual, that is the intellectual premise which we are presenting to you tonight. And to help that decision be made, which 3 of the 4 passengers get to weather the storm and finally arrive at safety, and which one is going to not so willingly self-sacrifice and be consigned to a watery fate, is entirely in your hands. Or maybe not entirely in your hands, because you will be helped to make the decision by our 4 star speakers to my left. So what these 4 speakers are going to do is they're going to be speaking on behalf of one of the 4 figures on this wonderful time-space continuum of a shoddy raft. But rather than, qua some ordinary balloon debate, try and persuade you why their figure should survive and make it off this stormy boat, they're going to do something we think far cooler, and indeed far crueler, which is to try and convince you about the opposite. why their figure is so hateful, so despicable, or maybe just so unnecessary, that the ancient world, broadly conceived, would be better off without them, and why, therefore, this figure should be cast overboard and save the other three. So hopefully this idea, this premise, will either give you some new information about an ancient figure about whom you didn't know, or maybe about whom you thought you knew, but you never thought about them in this way. So that's what's on the menu. Think balloon debate, but turned on its head, not above, but at sea, and not advocating in favour of, but pitching against. So that's the formula, as it were. In terms of format, after I finish speaking, I'm going to introduce all four of our speakers, and they're going to speak sequentially for a certain number of minutes. We don't need to be too taxonomic about it. For a short amount of time, they'll give you their anti-pitch, as it were. And then afterwards, I'm going to give them a chance to give a kind of tiny lightning flash final plea as to why you should vote against their figure, vote for them to be cast overboard. Then Jimmy's going to come back on, and we are going to take a vote, which will be done by show of hands, and then there'll also be an online version of the vote for those of you to whom I'm also speaking. And then we will celebrate, or indeed commiserate, this fundamental shift to the history of the ancient world over some further drinks and canapes and conversation. So I hope that sounds, well, I hope it both does and doesn't sound what you were expecting to get. But as Jimmy said, you're in for it now. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Llewellyn Morgan. Llewellyn is Professor of Classics and Fellow of Brasenose College at the University of Oxford, where he's also head of department, so at the moment, my guide, my lead, my boss. The focus of most of his research is Roman literature and culture, and he's published very widely on Roman poetry, satire, historiography, and metrical form, including two excellent very short introductions, books in the very short introduction series, one on Ovid, and most recently, last year, on Horace. He's a regular public speaker, and you may well have heard him on BBC Radio 4 or read him in the Times Literary Supplement. And he also has a great blog, which I'd highly recommend, which is self-described as, quote, the marginalia of an easily distracted classicist. But hopefully he will distract you for the better tonight, and we'll be speaking about, or rather against, none other than the Muse herself. Thank you, Llewellyn.
Thank you very much. Right then, direct your eyes, ladies and gentlemen, at this demure figure in a simple but elegant dress. And I've got written here, cradling some kind of musical instrument, but I had nothing to do with the images. So, cradling something. A little aloof, she is, from the rest of the passengers on the boat. Her mind, no doubt, on higher things. This is the Muse. Inoffensive, you might think. More than that, the embodiment of inspiration, our portal to higher things. How could I possibly want to throw her out of a boat? Don't be misled. This Muse character is irresponsible, is dangerous, and is probably utterly incompetent as well. And by the time I've finished, you will be as determined as I am to rid this boat of her presence as soon as humanly possible. And can I emphasize the humanly there? Because in her persistent disregard for human feelings and interests, the Muse is just a typical god. Can I also point out that gods weigh more than humans? This is a very standard convention, and it would do exceptional good to the boat if we chucked the Muse out. However, an example we will all recognise, I hope, of the Muse's behaviour. You've been agonising how to phrase something, an email, a letter, a Facebook post, and suddenly it comes to you, that spark from heaven. It's crisp, witty, incisive, a pearl of insight so apposite, so exquisitely expressed that nobody will stand in your way. The job is yours, or maybe the pay rise, or just the rapturous applause. It will open all the doors. It will hand you the keys to the kingdom. But it comes to you in the bloody shower. There's no pen, there's no paper, and if there was, you're dripping wet. And before you're dry, that beautiful thought is long gone. Absolutely typical muse procedure. Another favourite is shaking you awake at 2 a.m. with an idea that you've been after for weeks. And this time there's a pen and there's paper, because this has happened before and you're prepared. But you wake up the next morning to some scrawled note which begins, the point is, ... and then there's a word and it's quadruple underlined. And it might say ectoplasm. It might say bean sprout. You have no idea what it says, and it's so infuriating. Now you think, yay. But what about all those towering literary masterpieces that we have the muse to thank for? Tell me, muse of the man of many wiles. Sing of the anger goddess of Achilles, son of Peleus. Sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or of Sinai didst inspire that shepherd, etc., etc. Well, let's study the muse's literary modus operandi. Sorry, it's Latin, I find it difficult. MO. Let's study it in more detail, and we'll take a nice familiar example, Virgil's Aeneid. Virgil's Aeneid is a poem that kicks off very sensibly, very promisingly. In the first 7 lines of Book 1, Virgil sets it out nice and clearly. Aeneas is a Trojan. He's going to travel to Italy, found Rome, overcoming some obstacles in the way. Juno's not very happy, but basically, bish, bash, bosh, and that's a perfectly functional national epic. But then what does the idiot do? He goes and invokes the muse. Aeneid, Book 1, line 8, Musa mihi causas memora. Muse, tell me the reasons. The muse instantly takes over the story, and before you know it, all chaos has broken out. The Trojans wash up in Carthage, of all places, Rome's greatest ever enemy. And Aeneas falls for the wrong royal personage, and in no time, everybody's getting massacred at the Battle of Cannae. I telescope things very slightly there. Ovid, a much more sensible poet than Virgil, had it right, absolutely right, in The Art of Love. He said no muses were involved in the creation of this poem. It is personal experience alone that drives this work of poetry. I'll be singing the truth and nothing but the truth. It's such a shame he got exiled for that poem, which is officially Augustus, but I suspect the muse. Now, one of my esteemed colleagues to my left is bound to come back at me with museums. Museums, of course, are musea. They are temples of the muses, and where would we be without museums? Well, as if museums are anything remotely to be proud of. The places where we've stashed all the loot that we stole from the innocent countries that we colonised. And then what happens is it gets nicked from the museum and flogged on eBay. And while I'm sure that's all good, clean fun, it doesn't seem to me a sensible use of time and resources. As for music, and somebody's bound to mention music, whoever throws J.S. Bach at me also has to justify the existence of Katy Perry. And I rest my case. OK, in all this so far, I've been talking as if there is just one muse, and frankly, if only that were the case. In fact, there are 9 of these characters messing with our heads. And each of them typically comes with an easily spelled and pronounced name like Terpsichore, Calliope, Polyhymnia, Melpomene. This is the point at which I have to inform you that the whole muse business is not just irresponsible, it is profoundly dysfunctional. Rome had a not awfully sensible system which gave the role of maintaining the money supply to young men. What could possibly go wrong? The magistrates in charge of the mint, officially, the tres viri auro argento aere flando feriundo, in case you're interested, were young Roman aristos at the very beginning of their political careers. So what they would do is squeeze onto these tiny discs of metal that they were arranging to have minted as much information as they possibly could about their families, because who your family was in Rome was your qualification for high office. So you'd pop an aqueduct on your an image of an aqueduct, obviously. You'd pop an aqueduct on your coins that your ancestor had built, or a jockey on a horse because great-great-great-great-granddad had set up some games or something like that, or, you know, image of a king, image of a hero that you were descended from. When it came to Quintus Pomponius Musa's chance for a spot of auro argento aere flando feriundo, he clearly had absolutely nothing interesting to say about his ancestors. Poor guy had no aqueducts to put on his coins, because he just puns on his own name Musa for the whole issue, minting coins featuring all 9 muses, 1 coin for each muse, and then an extra one of Hercules pretending to be a muse, of which the less said the better. Now, we never hear a single further word about Quintus Pomponius Musa. So this did about as much as you would expect for his political career. But let me take you through Pomponius Musa's muses, and I'll leave you to decide if this puts the muse in a good light or, as I pitch my argument, just proves that the whole show is an outrageous racket. The muse Thalia on her coin is holding a comic mask because she's the muse of comedy, but sometimes she's also holding a shepherd's crook because she covers pastoral poetry as well. Connection being that shepherds are no doubt intrinsically hilarious. The muse Clio holds a scroll, she's history. Urania points a stick at a globe, she's astronomy, as if astronomers need a muse. Melpomene has a tragic mask, tragedy, and a club. No, I don't know either. Euterpe is holding some pipes, because she's lyric poetry, and Polyhymnia just stands there, basically. But I'm guessing her jurisdiction is hymns, and there are probably quite a lot of them. Calliope has a lyre, she's epic. Erato has another lyre, but she's love poetry. Terpsichore has a slightly different kind of lyre, and she's lyric again, which is all as clear as daylight, isn't it? We have 3 lyres, at least 2 lyric muses, a club that nobody can really explain, and Polyhymnia just standing around looking bored. Let's give it a try, shall we? Excuse me, Euterpe. I'm planning to write some lyric poetry. Could I possibly trouble you for some inspiration, please? I'm Calliope. Oh, gosh, I'm awfully sorry. Euterpe. Lyric, you say? Let me check. Does it involve any dancing? Well, I don't know. I haven't had any inspiration yet. You better talk to Terpsichore just in case. Will it have a historical dimension? Well, maybe. Clio. Then, 2. Is it sad? No. I was planning something funny, you know, with shepherds. Failure! Come on. Who are they kidding? It's an elaborate exercise in conveying competence and specialisation, and it's complete and utter chaos. And I should know about this kind of thing. I work in a university. I would offer one piece of advice, though, before I get back to my argument. You will, all of you, be seeking inspiration this evening as you decide how exceptionally generous you're going to be to Classics for All. And if you are, thinking those terms, and do please take what I'm about to say the right way, ladies and gentlemen. If you are stupid enough to seek inspiration from the muses, well, I can recommend Calliope, epic. She's good for the kind of sum that's so enormous that the digits run off the edge of the check. Think grandeur, hyperbole. That's very much Calliope's area. But you may also have some kind of longer-term arrangement, and for that it's euterpe, I think. Lyric poetry is basically an exercise in saying the same thing 1,000 times. Life's short, let's drink and sleep together. So, as you can appreciate, it's very appropriate to a standing order or a similar financial mechanism. Right, where was I? Okay, yes, this muse business certainly confused the socks off the ancients. The only surviving image of Virgil, a mosaic from Hadramautum in Tunisia, has the poet flanked on one side by Clio, history, on the other by Melpomene, tragedy. Mate, you're writing an epic. Where's Calliope? Where is Calliope? I mean, right, the scroll on Virgil's knee in this mosaic reads, Musa mihi causas memora. Muse, tell me the reasons. Muse, tell me why. Well, quite. It's astonishing that anything decent got written at all by the Greeks or the Romans with this kind of ancillary support. The muse, then. Never there when you need her. Certainly nowhere to be found when I was writing this last night. And running a chaotic operation where she, when she is around, if not a positively fraudulent one. Join me, fellow mortals. Let us free ourselves from supernatural inference from a bunch of weirdos flaunting lyres and pointy sticks and stuff with unpronounceable names. Treat the muse with all the respect that she shows to us by chucking her without delay into the sea.
Thank you so much, Llewellyn, for giving us plenty of angst to ponder about the modern day university, the muses plural, and poor old Katy Perry. Without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Frisbie Sheffield, who is Associate Professor of Classics at the University of Cambridge and Fellow and Director of Studies at Downing College. She's interested in all areas of ancient philosophy, particularly ancient ethics and politics, and her research explores desire, love and friendships, and considers their role in the good life for Plato and Aristotle. But I have a feeling she'll be considering somewhat more negative emotions and impulses in what follows, and Frisbie is going to take us into a different space and time and to make the case for the overboard casting, if that's the right way of putting it in a noun phrase, of none other than Alcibiades. Thank you.
So, good evening, everyone. Alcibiades, born 453 BC, was a major figure in Athenian cultural and political life, known for his charisma, sexual excess, and soaring political ambition. He was responsible for many disastrous events in Athenian life. I must confess, though, that if I could gaze on the face of any figure from the ancient world, it wouldn't be Schleiermann's Agamemnon, but Alcibiades, a dazzling looker by all accounts. But wow, did he use those looks to seduce and manipulate, as we shall see. So apparently he pranced around Athens with a shield that displayed a thunder-bearing eros, as if to announce his power to seduce and the protections that might afford him. As Aristophanes summed it up in one of his plays, The Frogs, the Athenians loved him, they hated him, and above all else, they longed for him. Now, in addition to those looks, he was a man with connections. When his father Clinias died in battle, he was brought up in the house of the great Pericles, where he mixed with the intellectual elite of the day. Now, despite that dazzling combination of good looks, charisma, and so the sources say intelligence and ambition, his life was marked by scandal, betrayal, and treason. And in their ambivalent relationship to Alcibiades, the Athenians nursed their own doom, or shipwreck, should I say. That's why he's got to go. Well, I'm going to give two specific reasons for why we should throw Alcibiades overboard. First, he played a role in the trial and death of the great philosopher Socrates. And second, he betrayed Athens and contributed to their defeat in the war with Sparta. For those of us who love either Socrates or Athens or both, those are really good reasons why he's got to go. So I start with the damage to Socrates. Alcibiades was notoriously good-looking and had many lovers. He engaged in that socially permissible Athenian practice of pederasty, where a bright, attractive youth would be sought as a beloved Eromenus of an older lover, Erastes. Alcibiades exploited his charms and looks ruthlessly with both men and women, and one of his targets was Socrates. Plato dramatizes this vividly in the Symposium. Alcibiades is there made to relay how he tried to seduce the older, ugly Socrates, a brazen reversal of the conventional norms of courtship. Though Plato gives this a charitable twist, claiming that Alcibiades sought self-improvement by this means, other sources claim that Alcibiades preyed on Socrates to serve his own political ends. Alcibiades discusses, again in Plato's Symposium, how he offered his body in exchange for Socrates' wisdom. Socrates refused Alcibiades' sexual advances. In a manner reminiscent of the recent Me Too movement, Socrates says he's not going to be implicated in any abuse of his supposed authority in educational matters to take advantage of the young. He evidently thinks it's outrageous that young men were encouraged to prostitute themselves to service their careers and will have no truck with that practice. So he refuses the exchange of sex for wisdom and spent the night with Alcibiades, we hear, like a father or brother. This left Alcibiades rejected and humiliated, especially as he goes on to explain, given how much he prided himself on his looks. So he really did think he was irresistible. Now, despite this episode, Alcibiades and Socrates continued to associate and were intimates for at least a decade. Numerous sources indicate Socrates' care for Alcibiades, both physically by saving his life when they served on campaign together, and psychically by trying to care for his soul. He tried to educate, as one source put it, by his love. Now, despite the care Socrates showed him, Alcibiades tarnished Socrates' reputation by association. Lest you think that I'm under the spell of my beloved Plato here, let me be quite clear that material here is drawn not just from Plato, but includes Socrates, Xenophon, and Aristophanes. Consider part of the charge against Socrates reported by Xenophon in his Memorabilia. The accuser of Socrates, said that Critias and Alcibiades, having associated with Socrates, did great evil to the city. In other words, it was because of the evils Alcibiades did to the city, on which more in a moment, that Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth. So arguably this was trial by association. And yet, by his own admission, in Plato's work at least, it was Alcibiades' own desire for ambition and personal glory that caused such damage. So he explains in the Symposium that he stopped up his ears when Socrates was talking, as if he was hearing the sounds of the sirens, and explains how he was worsted by his desire for the honours of the city. So he didn't stay the course and put in the work. As is well known, Aristophanes' Claus played a role in tarnishing Socrates' reputation, and some have argued that Pheidippides, that father-beating youngster tutored by Socrates in the play, is in fact modelled on Alcibiades. As Plato will later explore in detail, the truth behind Alcibiades' play, Aristophanes' play, is that argument can be dangerous when put in the service of victory and personal ambition. As if Socrates and Xenophon state very clearly, Alcibiades wanted to associate with Socrates because becoming well-versed in argument would give him the edge in public debate. As Xenophon puts it, politics brought him to Socrates, and for politics he left him. And Thucydides documents how Alcibiades used his argumentative skills to service his personal ambition by persuading the Athenians to embark on misadventures in the war. So the clear impression that I get from such source material is that Alcibiades seduced Socrates and employed his argumentative skills for personal gain, and the price was Socrates' reputation. Now, according to some recent scholars, Socrates is to be blamed for not sleeping with Alcibiades. If only Socrates had screwed Alcibiades, bemoans Jonathan Lear, then Alcibiades wouldn't have screwed Athens. But what Socrates urges us to see is that this would have debased both men. Socrates saw that Alcibiades was above prostituting himself and continued to care for him with no promise of pleasure for himself on the reasonable grounds that wisdom can't be exchanged in that way. If Alcibiades sought improvement, then he's got to work harder. And as various sources testify, it was his impetuosity and overwhelming desire for personal ambition that led him to abandon Socrates and turn to politics in a way that caused ruin to the city. So to that I will now turn. Throughout much of his life, Athens was involved in war with Sparta. Despite a peace treaty between Athens and Sparta in 421, Alcibiades wanted war as an arena for personal ambition. Thucydides, for example, talks repeatedly of his burning desire for honor. He got elected as a general, achieved a shaky anti-Spartan alliance with Argos, took a small force into the Peloponnese, but failed to achieve much of significance. His ambition not sated, he turned his attention to Sicily, on the grounds that this would give Athens much-needed imports. The conditions at this time were not favorable. The Athenians had been subject to losses of naval manpower, their imperial subject allies were rebellious, the treasury was low, and grain and shipbuilding timber were in shorter supply given the war. As Nicias tried to persuade Alcibiades, the idea of subjugating the large and powerful island of Sicily was to court disaster. But Alcibiades prevailed and was elected joint commander of the expedition. Now, in a pivotal episode, he went on a boozy night out the night before this expedition. And there were rumours that he mutilated the Herms on this very night, the night before the departure. So he was at a sort of drunken symposium, and apparently at that event, he also parodied the sacred mysteries of Eleusis. So both of these were extremely dodgy things to do on the eve of such an event. Particularly since Hermes was the god of travellers, this was seen as a very bad omen. So this seems to be a classic case of sort of posh boy antics. After a drunken night out, to take to the streets and smash things up, somehow seeing yourself as above the law. And I think this sense that he felt the rules somehow didn't apply to him reminds me of an anecdote told by Plutarch about his youth when he was losing in a wrestling match. He just bit his opponent. Now back to Sicily. When the expedition departed, Alcibiades had these charges of mutilating the Herms and profaning the mysteries hanging over him. On arrival in Sicily, the promise of assistance from Segesta was shown to be baseless, and other cities shut their gates against what they saw as the threat of Athenian aggression. In the midst of the crisis, a galley arrived from Athens demanding Alcibiades' recall to stand trial. When Alcibiades' ship stopped in Thurii overnight, he then vanished, didn't stand up and take responsibility. A death sentence was passed in absentia. He was a fugitive traitor for 8 years, living with the Spartans, where he curried favour by giving advice on how to defeat the Athenians. Despite the Spartans taking him in, he seduced the king's wife and tried to establish a bloodline in Sparta, so rogue antics indeed. The Sicilian expedition ended disastrously for Athens and destroyed their fleet. The Persian king, Darius II, saw an opportunity to avenge the Athenian victory at Salamis many years earlier and threw his support behind the Spartans. So Alcibiades, grossly opportunistic as he was, then sought refuge with the Persians and became an advisor. Now, in Athens itself, largely as a result of the Sicilian catastrophe, a conservative coup threw out the democracy and installed an oligarchy. Alcibiades negotiated with the oligarchy to return, offering Persian support. He won some minor naval victories for them on his return journey, as a result of which his inglorious past was erased from public records, along with a death sentence. So the Athenians forgave him. Did he learn his lesson or show any respect or gratitude? He did not. He was appointed strategos and sent out to win. Whilst busy rounding up pay for his mercenaries, he left no reliable officer in charge of his fleet and caused a crushing naval defeat. He retreated to Thrace and lived as a freeloader for several years. After the final decisive Spartan victory, he again offered his services to the Persians. He was eventually killed by some envoys from either Sparta or Athens in 404, naked, unarmed, and with his latest mistress, so the story goes. It's even unclear whether this story should be dignified as a political killing. Rumour has it that he had yet again been led by his loins and seduced a local Phrygian girl whose brother set out to avenge her. Now, Athens may have fallen without Alcibiades. Socrates may have been tried without him, but he played a key role in both events. He was all charisma and no substance, the sort of Boris Johnson of his day, who used the opportunities life had given him for personal gain and left destruction in his wake. If that isn't enough for you, he surely stands for everything we want to get rid of in the wonderful discipline of classics. This ultimate, irreverent posh boy who lived off his contacts and charms is everything we're trying to change about classics today. So Alcibiades has got to go.
Thank you so much, Frisbee, for such an informative and agonistic appeal against, gorgeous, energetic, well-brought-up guy who was evidently neither demure nor mindful. Moving on to our third speaker and moving forward in chronological time, it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephen Harrison, who is a lecturer in ancient history and currently admissions tutor at the University of Swansea. His research focuses on the ancient history from the 6th to 2nd centuries AD, BCE, depending on your preference. Sorry, BC/BCE. We've just got to decide which one we want to do and stick to it, because I always get confused. 6th to the 2nd centuries BCE, the era of the Persian Empire. And his research focuses on the Persian Empire, Alexander the Great, and the Hellenistic kingdoms. And he's currently finishing a book about these themes on kingship, Alexander the Great, and the early Seleucids. And so, perhaps unsurprisingly, he is going to, or maybe surprisingly, given that he's focusing so much in his research on this guy, he's going to argue that Alexander the perhaps not so great should be cast overboard. Thank you.
Hi folks, I'm going to address the elephant in the room. If you've paid 20 quid thinking you're going to hear the eminent Oxford Latinist Stephen Harrison, I'm sorry. I can handle not being the most famous or successful classicist, but not being the most successful person in your field with your name is a different thing. I think, having heard the first two speeches, I've sort of misjudged the tone, because I'm going to be honest, I'm coming out fighting here. I've been asked to speak for 10 to 15 minutes to persuade you that Alexander the Great deserves to be thrown overboard. But I don't need 10 to 15 minutes. I can do it in one. Because look at the alternatives. First of all, I've come straight here today from Freshers' Week at Swansea University. Getting drunk and knocking the willies of a few statues, Alcibiades has got nothing on our netball team. Muse did some pretentious music in the noughties, but this is an overreaction. And Herodes Atticus, I confess this is a Wikipedia jobby. I'm assuming he's not the guy who played right back for FC 20 in 1997. But I find out that he might have killed his wife. Now, I'm certainly not downplaying that or undervaluing that. Clearly, he was a terrible person. But I would not want to be part of an audience who decided that the life of one rich white person was worth more than the tens of thousands of people killed by Alexander. Now, that it got quite bold there, that start, I think. So I teach a course on Alexander, and every year I get new students in, and I sort of say to them, write down a few words about why you want to study Alexander, what you're interested in, what you think about this topic. Standard kind of thing, you know, get people discussing the things. And every year somebody writes, because he was cool. And I'll say to you what I say to them. Is genocide cool? Now, I was told to offer a light-hearted roast of my nominated figure. And I hope that my terrible Muse pun, which literally everybody I know begged me to cut from this speech, has convinced you that we will get light-hearted. But when we talk about Alexander, I think it is really important to foreground questions like that, about is genocide cool? Now, we can debate whether that's an appropriate word, but ultimately the raw facts matter. As Brian Bosworth, the doyen of Alexander studies in the last 50 years, put it, I'm going to pick this up so I can actually read it properly and not misquote him. Alexander spent much of his time killing and directing killing, and arguably killing was what he did best. Now, those students who say Alexander is cool tend to be those people who've encountered him in films or in video games. Is it okay to reenact Alexander's campaigns in these formats? To play along, to rejoice, to celebrate in the slaughter of representations of people and communities who we know lived and died at his hands? Is it okay that I've chosen to talk about Alexander at an event where the brief explicitly demands me to have a laugh? Is that okay? Now, obviously, we cannot judge Alexander by the standards of today, but there are hints that even ancient authors saw Alexander's behaviour as excessive. In India, for example, Alexander campaigned against a tribe known as the Malay. Arrian describes how he divided his army up into 3 groups. A small unit went out in front of the main army. The idea was that anybody who fled from Alexander would run into them and be captured and killed. Anybody who slipped through Alexander's main force would be mopped up by another army unit marching 3 days behind. The instructions that he sent out to his men was clear. Kill any Indians who were found, regardless of whether or not they offered resistance. And that seems to me to be a pretty clear reason why Alexander should not be celebrated, but should be cast overboard. Now, so I do think that this is not funny, this next bit. It's just a genuine reflection. I sort of think that the fact that episodes like that take place in India perhaps affect our judgment, particularly in Britain, is kind of those examples a little bit too familiar for those of us who are schooled on the excesses of the British in India, particularly when the precedent of Alexander was evoked by those who advocated on behalf of the British Empire. Perhaps the setting of these events strikes a chord with our innate post-colonial guilt in a way that does not happen when we read descriptions of Alexander's behaviour elsewhere. And I would certainly agree that there are some bad figures involved tonight. I completely accept that the Muse really should have had a word with Thucydides and said, you know what, son, why don't you make it a little bit easier to read? Just a little bit. But however we see the morality of any of the figures involved tonight, any of their qualities or characteristics are dwarfed by the magnitude of Alexander's actions. A Route 1 solution, a Sam Allardyce cold, wet, windy Tuesday in Stoke solution to this debate is to say, simply, let's get rid of the worst person. But that's pointless, because on that score, the answer is obvious, and Alexander has to go. So I've taken the easy way into that. Alexander's obviously the worst person. And I've plunged into a character judgment. And I've carefully selected the worst example I could think of. And I've laid the rhetoric on pretty thick. Could I have given examples of Alexander being nice? Yeah, of course I could. But where this debate gets interesting, I think, is to think about reasons other than personality and character for throwing somebody overboard. Instead of thinking about the morality of these figures, why don't we think about what they actually did, their historical contribution? And with Alexander, we're on to a real problem with this. The earliest surviving account of his life was written 3 centuries after he died. And that basically means we just don't know anything about his life. For almost every single fact you think you know about Alexander, I could make an argument why that didn't happen. Almost everything. There's so much more that will have happened that we don't know because people made choices over time to leave it out. The record we have of Alexander is incredibly incomplete. And then we've got 5 main sources from antiquity, right? One of them is a summary of someone who was writing 300 years after Alexander. That's the 5th best source. It's ridiculous. And they're all writing from the perspective of the victor. The archaeological evidence is almost non-existent. We should throw Alexander overboard because we can't evaluate what he did. I'll illustrate this with one example. In 334, Alexander invaded the Persian Empire. That's a fact we actually know. Although just how firmly we can date it is actually a question. Now, the Persians were waiting for Alexander, and they fought a battle at the River Granicus. 2 facts. I'm giving you 2 facts. That's what we've got. Because then we hit problems. Aegean says Alexander was advised to make camp by the river in the hope that the Persians who were guarding the banks would withdraw, and the next morning they could cross. Alexander apparently refused, said this would be cowardly, launched straight into battle. Diodorus, however, says Alexander did make camp and only attacked at dawn. Who should we believe? Aegean had access to the eyewitness testimony of Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals. That's a point in his favour. But he's very clearly heroising Alexander, which might seem suspicious. Now, you might see there's blank faces because you're looking at me saying, does that matter? Yeah? We know that the Macedonians had to fight their way across the river. Does it matter whether it was at 7 o'clock or 1 o'clock? So is this just semantics? But actually the answer to that question says a lot about who you are as a historian. Now, most people, I think, would think that question is quite trivial, because the stuff that matters is the battle. All right, well, what happened in the battle? Well, the sources report that Alexander personally led a thunderous cavalry charge into the rushing waters, his warriors spurred on by the fervour of their young commander. As they advanced, Alexander cunningly positioned the front of his column beyond the reach of direct assault. Yet the towering ranks granted the Persians a strategic advantage, leading to an intense initial exchange that exacted its toll on both sides. Amidst the chaos, the air resounded with the clash of steel, and the scene erupted into a swirling melee with Alexander at its heart. Alexander's blade found its mark time and again, claiming the lives of Mithridates, son-in-law to the Persian king, and Rosicles, a noble of great renown. Yet, as victory seemed within his grasp, danger lurked in the form of Mithridates, who sought to strike Alexander from behind until the swift intervention of Clytus severed his arm, halting the blow before it could find his target. With the tide turning in his favour, the Macedonian cavalry surged forward, driving the Persians back in a frenzied retreat that bordered on chaos. I've got a confession to make. I got ChatGPT to write that description. Why did I do that? Well, I was finishing this on the train. But seriously, the reason why I did that is because I despise battle narratives. They do funny things to historians. Visions suddenly fleet. Spears glint and glisten. Shields clash. Dreams are dashed. Phrases historians would never normally use, enlivened with gratuitous half-rhymes and needless alliteration. Partly that's because we mimic the style that we read ourselves, so the genre creates expectations. But it's also because battles seem like a chance to add a dash of excitement to our narratives. Playing on the senses creates a phenomenological experience which draws the reader in. We hear the war cries, which are always fearsome. The horse's hooves, which are pounding. Sometimes there are screams which are piercing, or sometimes blood-curdling. But should battles be exciting? Should we try to write so evocatively that a reader can almost imagine themselves alongside Alexander, straining every sinew to keep up with him as he charges, beads of sweat forming on furrowed brows? We are talking about the death, genuinely, of thousands of people. Perhaps this all happened so long ago that it's easier to be detached, to forego the personal cost of battle and simply enjoy the ride. But where do we draw the line? If we glorify battles in the ancient world, then we are complicit in the celebration of war. In Alexander's case, this is a very particular kind of war, unprovoked, expansionist, imperialist. We can point to the different values of his era and mitigation and argue that we cannot judge Alexander against the standards of today. That's obvious. But irrespective of context, whenever we seek to paint a vivid picture of a daring cavalry charge or a heroic death in single combat, we imply that there is nobility in this, that this is somehow a model to emulate. There is more to this than my snowflakish wokery. My other great objection is that portraits of ancient battles often offer an entirely unrealistic picture of how things work. Maps are drawn. Arrows show how different units moved and various stages of battles are marked out. At the centre of things, generals push troops around like chess pieces, always in control. Here's one example from a book about great battles of the Hellenistic world. It's written about the Battle of Issus, which took place a year after the Granicus. Here we go. As Alexander watched the distant seashore speechless, he saw the fate of his great bid to conquer Persia dangle by a thread. With more than a mile between them, Alexander knew that the only help he could provide to Parmenion's doomed men was to set his masterstroke into motion without a moment's delay. Come on! This is what Alexander does to us. Alexander was not looking at Parmenion's doomed men over a mile away in that battle, because that battle was essentially fought on a beach. And when you put 20,000 horses on a beach, you get clouds of dust. You can't see a mile. You're lucky if you can see 10 metres. And what this shows, this example, and the reason I want to throw Alexander overboard, is that he's not a serious subject of study. What other field would have clever people debating whether or not a man who lived 2,500 years ago was good or bad? Based on a handful of lines written down centuries after he lived by authors who might have been using primary sources or might just have been making stuff up. Was Alexander gay? What a stupid question. What other field would transfer modern modes of thinking to the ancient world and expect to be taken seriously? Can you imagine if I went into work and said, "Oh, guy, I've come up with a new project. I'm going to write a new book. Oh, what's your book called, Stephen? I'm going to call it Was Julius Caesar Italian?" Absolute nonsense. It's pointless. What kind of moron would dedicate their life to studying this topic? There's nothing new left to say. Alexander the Great, Lives and Legacies by Stephen Harrison, will be published by Reaction Books in June 2025. See, that's what Alexander does. The only reason I said yes to this was to promote a book that's not even out yet. Studying Alexander makes you an egoist like he is. So for the sake of future students, to save them from making the same choices that led me here tonight, throw Alexander off this boat and get rid of this ridiculous discipline. So, I think I could make quite a strong argument that out of all of the options in front of you tonight, you should vote to throw Alexander overboard. But I'm not going to do that. Instead, I want you to reject the entire premise of this debate. Sorry, Emma. Who are you? Who are you to cast judgment on people who lived thousands of years ago? It's easy to criticise people when you're far removed from events and when your decisions have no ramifications. So let's imagine, Emma asked this earlier on, let's imagine that these figures are actually here, listening to us debate their fate. No matter how bad you think they are, could you live with the guilt of casting a living person or a sort of living person into the sea? Fortunately for you, I can offer you a way out. To explain, we have to go back to India. I talked about Alexander's treatment of the Malay in India, and the denouement of that campaign is remarkable for another reason. The Macedonians had chased the Malay back to a major city and began to assault the walls. Some Macedonians were trying to undermine the walls, others were clambering up assault ladders, trying to get into the citadel. But Alexander was unhappy with the slow progress that was being made. He grabbed a ladder from a passing soldier and he set it up against the wall himself. He climbed up, followed by Pucestus, Leonatus and Abrias. But then disaster struck. The Macedonians were so inspired by Alexander's example that they surged to follow him up the ladder, and the ladder snapped under their weight, sending soldiers tumbling and leaving Alexander isolated. He cut a conspicuous figure on the walls of the citadel, resplendent in his armour, and he was an easy target for the Indians. Some were firing down at him from towers, others were throwing javelins up at him from the ground. Alexander had a choice. He could stay where he was on the wall and be shot to pieces, or he could accept that the situation was hopeless and clamber down to his men. But no, Alexander, we are told, Alexandered. He jumped down, not back to safety, but into the crowd of Indians, backed himself up against the inside of a wall so he had some protection, and he started swinging. Of course he did. What else was a proud descendant of Achilles supposed to do? One Indian was dispatched, then another and another, until none were prepared to come near him. Instead, they kept the distance, just lobbing whatever they could find at him. Abrias had no choice but to follow Alexander's lead down into the city. He was killed. Pucestus and Leonatus were the only people left to support the king. Inevitably, Alexander was soon hit by an arrow. He fought on as best as he could, but weakened as he lost blood. His legs gave way and he fell slumped over his shield. Now that, in a nutshell, is the story of Alexander the Great. We can shift our gaze to other players, to the Indians here defending their homelands, to the Macedonians who we might cast as followers or enablers of the king. But however far shifting historical tides shape our study of this period, at the heart of it all is one man careering around Asia, choosing the heroic option when it was available, manufacturing it when it was not. Whether this is seen positively or negatively, the whole point of Alexander is that he Alexandered. And that's why he can never be the subject of a serious discussion. We aren't talking about a historical figure. We're talking about an illusion, about an image that tells us more about the people who have written about Alexander and their time than the man himself. And that ultimately is why we should throw him overboard. But actually, we don't need to do that. Because for us tonight, Alexander and his Alexandering means something different. It means this entire debate is entirely redundant. We don't need clever speeches. We don't need a vote. We don't need to throw somebody kicking and screaming, as Alcibiades undoubtedly would, overboard, and then feel guilty about condemning someone to death, whatever their crimes may have been. We just need to say this. Alexander, I bet you can't swim back to shore. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. And you were all laughing so hard you might have missed the very subtle plug to his new book, which is coming out in June next year. But, you know, I think, as you can probably tell, it is going to be bloody brilliant. But the title strikes me as being a bit boring, and I think we can all put together a better one based on what we've just heard. I'm thinking Alexander the Great - snowflake wokery and intellectual self-loathing.
I've got no idea how hard I have to keep that line in the book.
So, our final speech of tonight moves us again forward in ancient time, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Emily Kneebone, who is Assistant Professor of Ancient Greek Literature in the Department of Classics at the University of Nottingham. Her research centres on the Greek literature written under the Roman Empire, with a particular focus on epic poetry from the 1st to 6th centuries, and I'm going to get this right this time, AD/CE. Wonderfully in keeping with the aquatic theme of tonight's imaginative focus, she's the author of a brilliant book from 2020 on Oppion's Halieutica, which is a 2nd century AD Greek didactic epic on the sea and all of the crafty hostile fish that inhabit it. And our final figure this evening, which Stephen's already given us a sneak preview of, is from this Greco-Roman era of antiquity. She'll be enlightening you and hoping to enrage you about a guy called Herodes Atticus.
Thank you very much, and I can promise you I am not writing a book on Herodes Atticus, I just hate him. So that's where we're at. So my figure is Herodes of Athens, that's what Atticus means, just from Athens. And I doubt many of you have heard of Herodes. I'm aware it's quite a hard sell to make you hate somebody you've never even heard of. But essentially, Herodes was a superstar orator from the 2nd century AD. He was a politician, he was a teacher, he was immensely famous, he was pretty legendary in all sorts of ways in that era. He was the single most important man after the emperor in that period in the 2nd century, and probably the richest. So he lived in Athens in the 2nd century when Greece was part of the Roman Empire, and Greece was trying desperately to prove how relevant it still was. Had no money, no political influence, but had a lot of culture. And that's what Herodes did. He basically sort of sold the idea of Greek culture. And he was apparently an excellent orator and a teacher, and he tutored several Roman emperors, including Marcus Aurelius. But most of all, he was rich. He was unimaginably rich. Think rich and then triple it. And he flaunted this wealth. He used it to get what he wanted, and that's partly, I think, why he has to go. He was absolutely unscrupulous in gathering wealth and then using it to buy himself fame and renown. He did some good things. Like all of the others here, he wasn't wholly 100% evil, but he was pretty bad. So he funded building and refurbishment projects on a massive scale. He rebuilt lots of classical buildings that had fallen into disrepair. So in the 2nd century, things were rotting. He built stadia, temples, baths, aqueducts, and his buildings have lasted. So if anyone's been to Athens, you may have come across this building here. So this is his Odeon. It's on the slopes of the Acropolis, so, you know, really putting himself in the centre of Athens. And it's a massive 3-storey theatre that he built, still being used as a music venue today. So I understand that Coldplay just filmed a video there, and they put that on TikTok. And if anybody is into Greek rock, there is a gig there this weekend if you're interested in flying over. So what's the problem then? Why do I hate him so much? And I think there are 3 reasons. The first is that the money wasn't his to give. Secondly, he funded these things because he was utterly obsessed with his own reputation, with his status. He wanted to be known, and he never ever knew when to stop. He just wanted to impress people no matter what the cost. And thirdly, he dedicated the Odeon, this fancy theatre, to the memory of his dead and very pregnant wife, whom he just killed for absolutely no reason. And that's what I think infuriates me. There wasn't even a reason for it. And we'll get to that in a minute. So I'm arguing that Herodes was selfish, he was arrogant, and he was murderous, and he needs to go. So my first charge is embezzlement. Now, Herodes came from a well-connected family. We've heard about how important it was to be well-connected in the ancient world. So this was an Athenian dynasty, basically, that traced its lineage right the way back to hotshot politicians of classical Athens, so important generals in the Persian Wars. So that had quite a lot of cachet in this period. He was related also, he claimed, to Theseus, Achilles, Alexander the Great, and Zeus. Right? So these are big claims. Already I dislike the man. His more recent ancestors were politically prominent, so they had kind of close relationships with emperors from Julius Caesar, Augustus, Claudius, and others. And he used that. He exploited these close connections with the emperor to get away with everything he possibly could. So he was probably the richest man of his day. He built and owned more than anyone except the actual emperor. And his wealth included kind of huge property empires and several marble quarries. Most of it, though, was inherited. So, and this is where it gets really dubious. His father said in one of his houses there happened to be a fortune. He just stumbled upon it. Nobody knew. The man who sold the house didn't realise there was an enormous fortune in there. His father said, "Oh, I found a fortune. Do you mind if I keep it?" The emperor said, "Oh, go on then. Go on, it's yours." He then became, overnight, phenomenally wealthy. So it's all pretty suspect as far as I'm concerned. Nevertheless, the father wasn't a bad man, and he decided he was going to leave a lot of this fortune to the city of Athens, to the people of Athens. He was sort of public-minded in that sense. So every Athenian was due to get an allowance of money every year from Herodes' father's will. Herodes didn't like this. He wanted all the money for himself. So he was furious. Apparently, the sources say that he unleashed absolute vitriol when he heard this news. You can imagine the will reading ceremony. He was tearing things up and throwing things, stormed out, unleashed this absolute torrent of insults against the Athenian people. He was an Athenian. Now, this is his city. So he eventually negotiated with the banks and said, okay, let's instead of everybody getting allowance every year, they're going to get a single lump sum. And they said, okay, fine. The Athenians agreed a lump sum that they would all get. So they all turn up to the bank to collect their lump sum. They're very pleased. It's probably, these are poor Athenians, quite a lot of money for them. They turn up, but the bank says, no, I'm afraid actually that's not going to work. And I'm afraid actually you owe us money. And what Herodes had done was he'd gone back, combed through, and worked out all of the debt that the Athenian ancestors owed his ancestors, going back generations. So he was calling in ancestral debt. So everybody turning up to collect their money from the bank was now told they owed thousands because of what their great-great-great-great-great-grandparents had done to Achilles or someone. It is absolute lunacy. And this worked. So he kept all the money. He never gave any of the money to the Athenians. So he had effectively cheated them all out of wages, out of a pension, out of an allowance to keep the money for himself. And the Athenians never ever got over this. And they always maintained that these huge buildings that he had built were built with their money. So one of the things that he did was he rebuilt the Panathenaic Stadium in white marble. It's still the only all-marble stadium in the world. It still exists. It's a massive scale. He added 50,000 seats to it, 50,000 to this stadium. It was just a running track before, but he wanted it to be huge. It's where the first modern Olympics were held in the 19th century. And it's still where the marathon, the Athens Marathon, ends. And in order to do that, in order to build on this stadium, he used an entire year's worth of marble from the local quarry. He just sort of used up the entire thing on this stadium. And the Athenians were livid. So they said this was their money. He'd stolen it from them. So Panathenaic means for all the Athenians, so the pan being all. And they said, well, yeah, that's exactly right. That's the name it should have, because it had been built with the money that belonged to all the Athenians. So it really was the Panathenaic Stadium. So my first charge then is that Herodes embezzled public money from the Athenian people, used up a whole year's supply of marble to build this gleaming white stadium just so that people would talk about him. He loved these grand gestures. He loved the sound of his own voice. He was an orator known for talking and talking and talking. And he loved being known. He was obsessed with his own legacy, and he wanted to leave his mark on the city for centuries to come. So pretty much everything he did had his own legacy in mind. This is something that you get in this period. People pretend that they're doing something for the public good, but actually what they're doing is promoting themselves. And he wanted to make sure that nobody ever forgot him. So he regularly used things like the most expensive materials he could ever find just to flaunt his wealth. But this brings me to my second charge, that he was not only an embezzler, but also arrogant and narcissistic, and he thought he could buy anything and anyone that he wanted to. So Herodes had huge influence, and he used this to get what he wanted. He was a fluent speaker, but again, he used that to manipulate literally everybody around him. We have dozens and dozens of these records of him using this simply to get what he wants. He was incredibly rude and very insulting to other orators, and demanded utter loyalty from his students as well. So the Athenians called him an oppressive tyrant, and they hated this. But he was still able to manipulate them. He could manipulate things like the law courts, the emperors, all of the sort of public institutions of Athens. So his daughter died. He had 6 children, but he was very sad when each of them died. Many of them died. He was a man who had violent tendencies. I'm not making any accusations completely unfounded in the ancient sources, but a lot of his family and friends died. So when his daughter died, he was sad, he was consumed by grief, But he got the Athenians just to take that day out of the calendar. He was just like, no, it doesn't exist anymore. That day does not exist. Remember, you've all got your calendars, cross it out. If you've got anything coming up next year, I'm afraid it's not happening anymore. That day does not exist. So imagine just being able to delete a date in the calendar just because you personally had a bad memory of that day. And if every plutocrat was allowed to delete a day in the calendar, we'd have no days left. We'd suddenly be in the 22nd century just because people have said, no, let's get rid of these days. You cannot have a system where someone is allowed idiosyncratically to decide that the day doesn't exist. So he had so much influence that he really, really hated people disobeying him. He was much fonder of his daughters than he was of his sons. There was one son in particular that really never lived up to his expectations. The son, his father was a great orator. You know, Herodes was known for being very good at public speaking. The son never inherited that ease with words. From the sources, it looks to me as if he might have had something like a learning difficulty, perhaps dyslexia, something like that. The child was clearly struggling to learn the alphabet as a child. And Herodes, being Herodes, found a solution. What many of us might have done would be to sit down with our child and help them learn the alphabet. What Herodes did was to buy in 24 enslaved children and name each one of them after a letter of the alphabet. So his policy was, well, if you learn who these people are, you'll be inadvertently learning the alphabet, almost by accident. And I find this utterly outrageous on so many levels. First of all, the sheer arrogance of buying in 24 human beings instead of just spending an hour teaching your son the alphabet. And more importantly, what the hell do you do once he's learned the alphabet? You then got 24 slaves in your house. Do you rename them after difficult words? Do you name them after equations? Like, where do you go from there? And imagine if you were a slave who'd just been renamed Pi. Right? And now you're leading your whole life named Pi just because someone for a day couldn't learn the alphabet. So to me, this embodies the kind of very worst type of short-term thinking that characterises Herodes. And we know that Herodes also treated his slaves pretty badly, so actually having an extra 24 of them around the house was a pretty dangerous thing. And this brings me to my third and final problem, which is that he really thought he could get away with absolutely anything, including murder. Now here's where, as in Stephen's case, the sources are pretty tricky, partly because our main source loved Herodes, but even he struggles with this bit, right? Even he has to acknowledge that there's a bit of sort of trickery going on here. So, for one thing, he was pretty aggressive. So we have it on record that Herodes physically and verbally assaulted the emperor. Right? Not just anybody, he assaulted a lot of people, but to assault the emperor. He was at the time a future emperor, but nevertheless. And he insulted the emperor again and again and again. And if he did this to the emperor, who else was he doing this to? He was reprimanded for his behaviour more than once, but he maintained that he was too powerful, too important a man to apologise even to the emperor. And instead of apologising to the emperor, he bombarded Marcus Aurelius with even more complaints as a kind of test, to really test how much he could extend his influence to. And I find this extraordinary. Okay, so in the ancient world, it would take months to get a message to someone, especially if they were well across the emperor. He wrote to the emperor 3 times a day, right? And many of the messages simply said, "Why haven't you replied to my last message?" Which, if anybody's had a follow-up email from somebody after they've taken a little too long to reply, you can know is deeply irritating. So in many ways, he was a man ahead of his day in his manipulation of the media. And I am just thrilled that Herodes was not alive in the time of Instagram and social media. Otherwise, I think we would really all be in trouble. So eventually, this did catch up with him and he was exiled, perhaps for plotting against the emperor, we don't quite know. So normally what happens when you're exiled is you go somewhere really unpleasant because it's a punishment, right? What happened to Herodes is he decided he would go somewhere fine. What he'd do is he'd create a new city just for himself, where he could be the ruler of this city, and everything could be done exactly as he wanted. So then he carried on living exactly the way he wanted to, not subject to anybody's rules, which is not the point of exile. Right? You don't create a new kingdom when you're exiled. So Herodes then bullied, insulted, and physically assaulted the most powerful man in the world, the Roman emperor. What else did he do? Well, we've already touched on this, but in 160 AD, Herodes' wife, Regilla, miscarried and died while 8 months pregnant. You might think, well, this can happen particularly in the ancient world. Pregnancy and labour were difficult. No. Her brother took Herodes to court for murder. Right, her own brother. So the accusation was that he had ordered his own freedman to kick his pregnant wife in the stomach because she'd offended him in some sort of very trivial domestic way. This sent her into premature labour and she died. So he denied ordering his wife's death, but even he had to admit he didn't have a great track record in terms of hitting people. And so there was a lot of scepticism in the ancient world about his defence, particularly because he didn't have any evidence for his defence. So his defence rested entirely on the fact that he was sad. So he said, well, not only was I sad, but I was the saddest man you've ever seen, right? So he went on this huge campaign to prove exactly how sad he was. So it was incredibly ostentatious and extremely public. So he built this theatre, right, this 3-story theatre that Coldplay are now playing in, right, is a confession, I think, of guilt at killing his 8-month pregnant wife, Regilla. Right, he engaged in incredibly elaborate performances of grief. What he did was he shipped in black marble from Lesbos and coated his entire house in it. Right, that's how sad he was. He couldn't live in a normal house because he was such a sad man. So he coated his house in black marble. He dyed all of the curtains, all of the fabrics in his entire house. He dyed black because he was sad. A friend who was visiting him said, mate, you're overdoing this. Okay, just stop. It's not right, this is a bit much. And he threw him out. They got into a fight. And eventually the friend just gave up and started joking to the cook that Herodes must be grievously insulting his dead wife's memory by not dyeing his supper black. At which point Herodes kicked him out and they didn't speak for quite a long time. So this is Herodes' proof then. So he said to the court, would he ever have grieved so dramatically and for so long and so deeply? Would he have turned his whole house black? Would he have built a theatre? Would he ever have done that and dedicated it to Regilla's memory? How could he possibly have done that if he'd killed her? Seems to me that there is absolutely no greater proof of guilt than these sort of ostentatious sort of hand-wringing in public displays of grief. So whether it was genuine regret as to her death or whether it was all completely a manipulative performance with an eye to the trial, and both of those accusations were levelled against him in antiquity, people saw through this. Everybody saw through this at the time. There was huge debate. So something doesn't add up here. The trouble is, Herodes was very rich. Herodes was a rich, rich man who had taught the emperor. So the emperor was the one who was deciding on the trial. So this is his friend, his former student, the emperor, who he'd been messaging 3 times a day. The emperor acquitted him in the trial and he got away scot-free. But I think today, this is where you come in, it's time for a retrial. So I think you cannot get away with murdering your pregnant wife just because you're rich, you taught the emperor, and you have a flair for the dramatic. So vote with me against Herodes, and I think we need justice for Regilla.
Thank you so much, Emily. And I think there's a fantastic irony in that, before Emily's brilliant exposition, Herodes, as you said, was probably the least famous of our roll calls. So it's like, we might have heard of your Odeon, your Theatre of Sadness, mate, Coldplay, Greek rock, but actually we haven't really heard of you. So there's something wonderful there about, you know, what they say, that the real fear of a narcissist is not being loathed, it's being forgotten. So good on mainstream classics for not really giving him a place.
That's the justice there.
Yes, justice for Amelia there. So, the final sort of bit of the proceedings tonight, I suppose, well, penultimate bit of the proceedings before the all-important vote, is I'd just like to invite each of our 4 speakers up to give a kind of really one-sentence final plea as to why you should vote for their figure to be cast overboard. And we've been really quite kind of good traditional classics in very few ways tonight, but in the sense of we've stuck chronologically ish. I mean, the muse doesn't really fit there. So I think I'm just going to take chair's privilege and mess up the chronology a bit in terms of the order of final plea, and also because I think voting is often said to be affected by order and memory. So I'm just going to kind of completely mix it up and say we'll do, in terms of final plea, Frisbee, Stephen, Emily, and then Llewellyn. So final plea, and they'll all come up to the stand to give their final plea to you. So Frisbee first. Thanks.
Britain seems better without Boris. The classical world is better without Alcibiades.
I can't do it in a sentence because I've used all my good ideas. I thought I'd quickly respond to what other people have said. First off, Herodes, don't get it. Life of Pi, hugely successful. Alcibiades, Socrates sing. I haven't got kids, but I've got friends who've now got kids who are hitting that 2-3 point, you know, where they're like, oh, they can say the word carrot, great. And then your friends go, oh, they're so curious. They're always asking questions. Do you know what they're always asking? They're always asking why. They're always asking why. And then there's a point when you leave that child on the floor of a supermarket because they won't stop asking why. Alcibiades had nothing to do with Socrates. Socrates was just a bit of a prick. And then, finally, I guess, Llewellyn, this might be a bit of a personal question. We only met tonight, but have you honestly never felt like a plastic bag floating through the wind? You've just got to let the light shine. Even Katy Perry can be struck by the muse.
Right, Herodes has to go. He defrauded the Athenians, he murdered his pregnant wife, and he kept alphabet slaves.
I'm so distressed by the support for Katy Perry around the room here. Listen, Alexander the Great, I mean, there's this fantastic thing, the Alexander romance, which has got very little to do with Alexander the Great, except it wouldn't have happened without Alexander the Great. And you have people in Mongolia and people in Iceland and everywhere in between telling these crazy stories about Alexander going underwater. Oh, no, that's a dangerous thing to say, isn't it? So going underwater in a bathoscope, something like that. And bad stuff happens in the past, but we're stuck with it. And the most important thing is that Alexander is responsible for some of the most interesting stuff. Herodes Atticus was clearly innocent. I have absolute confidence in the Roman judicial system. And Alcibiades, he's just totally cool. I mean, the bit at the end where he just sort of stumbles out of his castle with his mistress. And that's, I mean, don't we all want to end that way? So yeah, it's just it's an easy solution here. Just chuck out the muse.
Thank you. So the mind and the morals are just bending at this point in the evening. I'm now going to hand back over to Jimmy, who is going to be in charge of the vote.
Great, good, fantastic. That was absolutely... Another big round of applause, please. Amazing. I love seeing academics tear each other apart. So, it's a very ancient way of voting. We're going to have a show of hands. People online, you can cast your vote in, they call it a chat room, I don't know. Sounds a bit sleazy. So the Muse. Hands up who would like to get rid of this importunate, kind of irritating person who arrives when you don't expect them. A bit like Amazon. Hands up.
Oh, come on.
Is that someone you know? Right. So you're almost, yes, you don't have nul point, but you have 1, 2, 3, 4.
Keep your hands up.
5. You're getting don't worry, Llewellyn, you're getting a sympathy vote now. 5, 6, 5. 5. I might not need to mark that down. The gloves are off. All right. When I was a kid, I always called him Alcibiades. Yeah. Right. Because a lot of people call it Alcibiades, and I always feel a bit, stupid. So Alcibiades, the Boris Johnson of his day. I would imagine Boris has that costume at home. He's that kind of a twat, isn't he? Okay, so Alcibiades, he wants to lob this posh boy out of the boat. Okay, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Down there. Is that about right? 18? And now we're moving on to Alexander the Great, who clearly had a very good agent to get the Great put after his name, considering what he got up to. Who would like to see him try and swim ashore? Because that's certainly what he'd like to do. Who'd like to see him, Alexander the Great, out of the boat? So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I mean, just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36. Well, it's looking bad for you. 38. 38.
I'm not sure Alexander.
So it's Alexander. So Herodes Atticus, obviously an ancestor of Donald Trump, with a bit of O.J. Simpson thrown in. So, all right, who'd like to see this despicable character thrown out of the boat? Now we're talking. This is a close. This is going to be a very close one.
A lot of people voting twice. It's one vote. It's one vote.
You didn't say the election was rigged. Yeah. Really can't be. Take me to court. Right. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35. So, and do we have the online vote? Does that come in? Does that kind of affect the postal voting? Well, Christina, do you have any numbers? 45%. Okay. Oh, it's on percentages online because they're in the chat room. So, we have a clear winner, and the clear winner is Herodes Atticus. Who said democracy doesn't work? Thank you so much. That was thank you so much. That was really, really brilliant. Really, really funny. And I have to say, it kind of, part of Classics for All is, apart from, you know, I learned classics at the state school in Liverpool, and then it was abolished from the state system. So we're trying to get it back into places where everybody can enjoy all the kinds of different pursuits you can now study classics with. The languages, not with the languages, with history, with the literature. It's a broad church, and these are the people who are purveying it at the top level. And there are many different people across the country in our hubs who are teaching kids from primary school all the way up to and into further education. And it's an amazing thing that's happening out there, despite the fact that the government don't really help us. So we need your help. We really need your help. And you can go onto our website, and I'm going to talk about money. There's a quote saying, people who die in wealth thus die in disgrace. I'd hate that to happen to anybody here. So go home tonight and make sure you do not die wealthy. Get onto the website, have a lot to drink. Remember tonight, feel sentimental, carpe diem. Whichever Latin or Greek phrase you remember from school, say it over and over again. Alter your wills. No, honestly, seriously, we are very lucky. We have fantastic friends and supporters, and they're joining all the time. And the charity is growing, and we've got a new CEO, Joe Hobbs, who's fantastic, and our team. I want to thank Christina. Tonight. Is Anna there? Annabelle? Yes? They do all the work. So keep supporting us, keep coming. We've got another thing coming along. We've got the moot trial of Medea. I'm surprised she wasn't up here tonight. She's up on a charge. Medea, can't think what it is. But that's, I think, in October. 24th October, you can buy tickets or you can watch it online. There are going to be drinks and canopies back there, and we have a chat about things. Lovely to see you all.
Back here.
Yes. As you walk out, you'll see the drink and the food, and it's all for you. And thank you again to Linklaters for a great evening. Thank you guys.